As the Russo-Ukrainian war continues to drag on, whilst discussions about ceasefires, peace treaties, and the line of contact are all ongoing in the background, Ukraine has been busy at work developing its own defensive and, well, technically missile capabilities, one of which is now capturing headlines and a lot of analysts' attention, otherwise known as the Flamingo missile.
The Flamingo really is the first heavy missile system in Ukraine's arsenal. This combination of large range with large payload, which results in a large capacity to inflict not just disruption, but whole-scale destruction. This will be one of the major advantages that Ukraine holds going into negotiations.
This is the Global Gambit.
As the Russo-Ukrainian war continues to drag on, whilst discussions about ceasefires, peace treaties, and the line of contact are all ongoing in the background, Ukraine has been busy at work developing its own defensive and, well, technically missile capabilities, one of which is now capturing headlines and a lot of analysts' attention, otherwise known as the Flamingo missile. Could this be a game changer? Is it going to be something that really makes the Kremlin, Putin, sit up and pay attention even more than they should be already? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing amongst some other broader changes amongst Ukraine's capabilities and Europe as well in this episode. Today I'm joined, or well, technically I should say, rejoined by Fabian Hoffman, who is a fellow with the Transatlantic Defence and Security Programme at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. We've been lucky enough to have Fabian on about 6-7 months ago at this point, and, well, as we know, a lot has changed. And Fabian, I'm delighted to have you back. I think very simply as a kickoff is, what is this Flamingo missile? I've seen it around, I've seen images and footage. Is it a game changer, or is it a little bit too early to tell?
Sure. So the Flamingo really is the first heavy missile system in Ukraine's arsenal that is indigenously produced. So produced by Ukrainian manufacturers for Ukraine. And it's heavy because it is, well, first of all, it's a lot larger. It's a lot heavier than some of these other missile systems, but especially because of the payload capacity that it can carry. So the big thing, the big difference really is on top of the range. It offers a range of up to 3,000 kilometers according to the manufacturer, but then it can also carry 150 kilograms payload across that distance. And if you compare that, to some of the other long and deep strike capabilities that Ukraine has had access to in recent months and years, range-wise, sure, it gets a bit farther than, let's say, some of these long-range drones that have a range of around 1,500, 2,000 kilometers. But really the big difference is that it can carry a very, very large payload compared to these drones and mini cruise missiles, which often are restricted to, somewhere around 20 kilograms to up to 100 kilograms. And so if you then increase that to over 1,000 kilograms, that's more than a tenfold increase. And so that is very, very significant. So really it is this combination of large range with large payload, which results in a large capacity to inflict not just disruption, but whole-scale destruction.
So I want to understand a bit more about the technical elements of this. And a lot of the viewers that I have on the channel will come from the US, the UK, and I'm sure some of them will be wondering, what are the comparisons to, say, other long-range strike systems like ATACMS or Storm Shadows in terms of range, payload, survivability?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a cruise missile. So it stays fairly low within the atmosphere. So I probably wouldn't expect Flamingo to be what we call a ground skimming cruise missile like Storm Shadow or Scalp-G or Taurus, for example. It probably stays a bit higher. I would estimate, several hundred meters, most of the flight, perhaps also in the beginning, some thousands of meters. But that's still, substantially lower than ATACMS, which reaches an altitude of up to around 60 kilometers and obviously has this ballistic trajectory. Whereas with a cruise missile, we get a pretty straightforward cruising trajectory, right? So that's the one big difference to ATACMS. And then if you compare that, to Storm Shadow, Scalp-G, the one I already mentioned, which I think is probably the most important, this thing is entirely indigenously produced. So you're not dependent on Western manufacturers to supply it. And of course, you're also not beholden to Western targeting restrictions, which were applied in the beginning. Towards the end, not so much anymore, but then Storm Shadow, Skull-PG arsenals were just also depleted, so it didn't really matter that much. So that's a really big benefit there. And then there's also, just some technical differences, as we already mentioned. The range, it would be, if the specifications are indeed correct, and if it indeed has a 3,000 kilometer range, it would be the longest striking capability in Ukraine's arsenal. So, even longer than these long-range drones that Ukraine has been using, but significantly longer in range than Storm Shadow and Skull-PG, which have a nominal range of around 560 kilometers. Although, it's also important to specify that a 3,000 kilometer range, that's probably the range if you shoot it in a straight line. But what you typically would want to do is, fly a more curvy trajectory in order to evade known missile defense positions. So that for the nominal range will then get depressed when it comes to the real range, which probably is a bit lower. But in the end, this weapon system really would allow, I think, Ukraine to reach most of the relevant targets west of the Urals. And that means basically there's then no real spot within Russian territory, within Russia's strategic depth, where in principle they can be safe. And that's really important because it turns this advantage of Russia's vast strategic depth into a disadvantage. Right now, they can say, okay, as long as we position certain infrastructure, certain manufacturing capabilities just far enough behind the border or the front line, they will be safe, and we don't have to cover them with air defense. But now if you create a weapon system like this, which can further extend the range of let's say, the attackable footprint on Ukraine's side, then you force Russia to also further disperse its air and missile defense capabilities. So suddenly this advantage of vast strategic depth becomes a disadvantage, because Russia has now, to utilize its by now rather limited air and missile defense capabilities. They're still available in fairly large numbers, but obviously less than in the beginning of the war. And now you have to put them, everywhere throughout your strategic depth. That's difficult. So that's also a really important point when it comes to this discussion.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It makes me think of during the Second World War when Stalin had to move a large array of the industrial capacity, further eastwards during Operation Barbarossa. So, but obviously now with this missile, all of that area of west of the Urals is vulnerable. And Ukraine, from what I believe, has claimed that they've already used them to target certain places inside Russia. Is that a credible claim, or what do we know exactly about their usage so far? Or this is more of a branding exercise so far? It's more about the psychological warfare component, at least for now. What do you expect in terms of potential application?
I really think, so far most of what we've seen from the missile is, a lot of it is marketing. It's the manufacturer that wants to showcase the missile system, that wants to demonstrate, right, that we have a good product that the Ukrainian state potentially wants to order. So we really have to see, can the manufacturer follow through on its promises, and also will this missile system end up playing a larger role in Ukraine's missile arsenal, because of course they have options, right? They have alternatives. At this point, Ukraine has a vast array of missile and long-range drone systems from which it can pick and choose, right? So this is also, I think this is probably also a bit an underestimated advantage of this whole episode. But even if this was only a marketing episode, it brings a certain dynamic into the competition inside Ukraine. And that is really important because, there are a couple of manufacturers who have been working on certain types of long and deep strike missile capabilities. For example, you may have heard, I think 3 days ago, they presented the Long Neptune for the first time, which is an adapted Neptune anti-ship cruise missile with a longer range, reportedly 1,000 kilometers, and then optimized for land attack scenarios. And this, for example, was one of these missile systems. We've known they've been working on that thing since 2022. Why the hell does it take so long, right? And so now if that manufacturer realizes, hey, there's competition out there, maybe Ukraine is not going to wait until I have my adapted Neptune finished. Maybe I should get going and see how I can accelerate this program. I mean, that's also a big advantage, right? So it is bringing dynamic in this whole deep strike missile capability sector in Ukraine. I think that's really, really important. The other thing, right? The manufacturer, they have said that right now they're producing one a day. and they would be able to scale it up by the end of the year to 7 a day, or over 200 a month, I think that would be very, very optimistic. I think even if they get a large order intake, even if the Ukrainian state places a large order, I think that would be very difficult to achieve. Personally, if the weapon system works the way that the manufacturer says it does, and it has the stated capability, I would be very happy if they can produce sustainably one a day. I think that would pose a lot of conundrums for Russia, and I think that would already bring Ukraine some advantages. But I have my doubts that they will be able to dramatically scale that up beyond that number, at least in the short term. Although I also have to say, I probably underestimated Ukraine a bit in that regard last year when they had, initially their ambitions of producing a large number of mini cruise missiles and long range drones. I was also somewhat skeptical, but I think at this point they have proven that Ukrainian industrial capacity, if it has the order intake, can scale up fairly quickly. So let's wait and see.
Fabian, if I can challenge you a bit on that point, though, because I mean, it's good for you to admit or acknowledge that you've had some, revelations in your assessments. But at the same time, how much difference is this missile actually going to make on the battlefield right now? Putin is a lot of pressure around across the fortress cities, as some people call them. Ultimately, yes, you can argue the missiles will be striking supply lines or important infrastructure that impacts the sort of further lines. But is that really going to make a difference in the short term? And doesn't Ukraine need to be looking at other options to strengthen its defenses?
Sure. So I would say, two arguments. I mean, if it makes a difference in the short term, who knows? But I'm certain that it will make a difference in the medium to long term. Not that it will be a war-winning capability, right? I think that sometimes, also I had an interview in the Wall Street Journal, and I used the term game changer, and people they
Almost
automatically associate that with a war-winning capability, which is now absolutely not. To me, a game changer is something that changes the rules of the game. And if Ukraine gets access to a 1,000-kilometer large payload capacity missile sustainably, right, that they sustainably can produce it and use it, that changes the rules of the game, that changes up dynamics in this war and to the benefit of Ukraine. So I think in that sense, it would constitute a game changer and it would have a positive effect. Now, how large that effect is going to be, that's really, really difficult to predict, right? I think even right now, I mean, looking in from the outside, looking in at what Ukrainian long-range drones and mini-cruise missiles, the ones that they have access to right now, what they're doing, we're seeing from the outside, right, that they're doing something. They're undermining Russian refining capacity, they're striking, supply nodes and transportation infrastructure and these sorts of things. We cannot tell from the outside how much of a difference this makes at this point, right? If, let's say, this exacerbates Russian operations by a factor of 0.1 or a factor of 0.3 or whatnot, right? Like, these are things that we may be able to figure out later when we have access to detailed Russian archives where they really, where it's documented how much of an issue this constituted. But it will make an effect, right? That's the really important thing. That's also the argument that I have made in support of these long-range strike operations since when they began. It's not that we're waiting for this final decisive moment where the Russian war economy suddenly collapses, right? This may or it may not come. This may come in a year or 5 or who knows, right? But right now it's about making sure that Ukraine can get every advantage that it can get. I think maintaining this current pace of deep strikes, especially to undermine Russia's war-sustaining industries, not just in a direct sense that the oil goes to the army, but also how it supports the state capacity at large via the state budget. I think that's a huge, huge advantage for Ukraine. And by the way, that's also a massive source of coercive leverage, right? If we think about a potential settlement at some point in the future, this will be one of the major advantages that Ukraine holds going into negotiations. Because as long as Ukraine has the capacity to strike this type of infrastructure at strategic depth at will, Russia will be aware that as long as this war continues, the war is associated with massive costs. So in that sense, I think it also makes a massive difference.
Well, then, what do you think that then does do for Moscow's calculus if we try to flip this on its head and approach this from the Russo perspective for a second, or the Kremlin's perspective? And obviously, the reason I used the term game changer in the opening was because I'd happened to have just read the article, the reference you mentioned about the Wall Street Journal. That's why I thought of you immediately for this conversation. But what do you think this does for calculus in Moscow, politically and militarily, if they know that the Ukrainians have this reliability to target, several hundred kilometers at least inside Russia?
Yeah, they absolutely hate it. They detest it. I mean, there is an argument, right, that one reason for the timing, the 2022 timing for the attack, was that Russia knew that Ukraine was inching towards this long and deep strike capability, and they basically wanted to preempt that, right? So that was also one of the reasons for the invasion. Not saying there was, any way the most important one, by far not, but I can actually see this being something that affected the Russian decision-making calculus in that moment, right? So I think by and large, they absolutely hate this capability of Ukraine, again, to strike strategic Russian targets at will. And obviously you have to put a bit of a relative there when it comes to striking at will, because Russia still can put air and missile defense systems there. It can disperse certain types of infrastructure or military targets. But by and large, Russia is unable to protect its whole territory. That's already the case right now, right? We know that because we have repeatedly seen Ukraine penetrate that airspace with converted two-seater airplanes that fly at a speed of around 100 to 200 kilometers an hour. And, they light up every radar. So it's not like they're very stealthy. And obviously, there are some issues with deconfliction. It could very well be that Russia did not want to shoot down some of these two-seaters because they were somewhat afraid that there's actually a human in there and making a huge mistake. But by and large, we've seen, I think, and that's very clear, that Russia is not able to protect its airspace right now. And that's only going to get worse as this war continues, as Russia takes more attrition of its air and missile defense capabilities, and as Ukrainian manufacturing capacity for, heavier missiles like the Flamingo, but also smaller long-range drones, mini cruise missiles, that's just going to expand. So that is something that is affecting the Russian decision-making calculus on a daily basis. I'm very certain of that. And then the last thing that is probably interesting to add here, I'm also very certain that we're reaching this threshold where very soon we will see Russian propagandists and also officials probably saying that any peace agreement or any settlement can only come about if it coincides with comprehensive disarmament of Ukraine in the conventional missile domain. Because they don't want to deal with this, what they're dealing with right now, they don't want to deal with that anymore in the future. So I think this is actually, it's very likely this is going to be a future demand in negotiations that Ukraine comprehensively disarms its missile arsenal and then also agrees to range restrictions, right? Let's say 200, 300 kilometers. Obviously, I don't think Ukraine could ever agree to something like that. And that would be, that's basically a non-starter, I think, from a negotiation perspective, because these types of long-range strike and deep strike capabilities, in my view, they're the best independent security guarantee that Ukraine has, that, Russia will think twice about attacking again in the future. So I don't think they will be able to agree to that. But Russia is certainly going to try. So this is something I firmly expect to see in the coming weeks and months.
Well, as we know, Putin has been very flexible in the demands that he's been making in Ukraine. He's obviously changed them multiple times. I'm being very sarcastic, audience. And I'm curious what you think about our conversation so far. So do add your comments below. But obviously, Fabian, one of the things about all of this is how much this plays into further escalation. What's the sentiment going to be felt like in NATO or European capitals specifically? So from the Russian perspective, they have tried to play catch up or outpace Ukrainian innovation. So do you think that the Russians could try to develop some kind of deterrence or ways to, intercept these kinds of missiles, or it's beyond that? So I'm kind of curious for your thoughts on the Moscow element of this, but also the European side.
So I think, in terms of, no, they cannot quickly adapt to come up with something to defend against that. I mean, this is also not just an issue for Russia, that's also an issue for us, right? When we think about European deterrence and deterring Russia, playing catch up with the offensive side as the defender, right? Or from a defensive perspective, that's inherently difficult in the missile domain. And that's the argument that I've been making, screaming against the wall, it seems like, for the last couple of years, that Europe urgently has to move towards an offensive strike capability as well, to complement that, or to complement its missile defense efforts, which have been ongoing very rigorously for a couple of years now. But that's just not going to be enough. And so that's also going to be the same, right, for Russia. And as they confront this growing Ukrainian missile capability and capacity, they will be well aware that they cannot stop that from the defensive. So I think, it is quite likely that Russia is also going to double down on its offensive arsenal. And we're just going to see an intensifying missile war, which unfortunately might coincide with a larger number of casualties on civilian casualties on Ukraine side, because as we know, Russia is very deliberate at times in targeting or at least accepting high civilian casualties when it comes to these missile strikes. I think more broadly, what this really is, it is an introduction to this conventional missile age that we are entering into, where, crises are likely to escalate fast. And as both sides in a conflict acquire or have acquired these substantial missile arsenals, it's fairly easy, to launch large numbers of these at short notice and to escalate a conflict. I think we've seen that, for example, in South Asia a few months ago between Pakistan and India, where the conflict also seemingly escalated rather quickly because both sides had access to these types of arsenals. So obviously then from a crisis stability perspective, there are some challenges. If you ask me now for solutions, I don't have them. I think we have to see how we manage that going forward.
All right, Fabian. So on that point then, what do we think about this going further forward? Is the Flamingo and just generally sort of the direction of Ukraine's remarkably fast-paced innovation trajectory going to mean that we see more sort of components, machinery, whatever equipment coming out that could really change the battlefield over the next, half a year or by next summer? The Ukrainians want to launch some kind of offensive then, or what do you think could happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about any looming Ukrainian offensive. I'm also, and again, that's always what I say. I mean, the Ukrainians have to decide how they want to fight this war. It's really not for me to make strong suggestions here. But in my opinion, I mean, I think what Ukraine is doing right now is pretty effective. Hold the line, try the adversary along the front line, and then accelerate this momentum of attrition by striking deep behind the front line against these high-value strategic level targets. So I think that's very effective. And if Ukraine continues that, I think that poses huge issues for Russia in the medium to long term. I think when it comes to the missile arsenal, I think, Flamingo to some extent, it might be the beginning of something, right? Again, we have to see if the manufacturer can actually follow through on the promises. So that's not yet guaranteed. But this direction that Ukraine has now been able, so Ukraine basically moved, right, from fully reliant on Western suppliers for missile technology towards building its own long and deep strike capabilities that are light in nature, right, because of their rather restricted payload capacity, towards moving or in the direction of long and deep strike capabilities that are heavy in nature, right? I think that is a natural progression that we're seeing, and that is going to continue. And as this continues, that makes things more difficult for Russia. And so Flamingo may be the beginning of that. It may not be, but then there will be a different type of heavy missile capability coming in the not so distant future that takes that role, right? Could be that short-range ballistic missile that Ukraine is working on right now, that reportedly also has entered into serial production, although I'd also be a bit careful there because we haven't really seen anything. Or it might be the long Neptune, right, that was presented, or it might be a totally different design. But at one point or another, Ukraine will be able to complement its existing missile and long-range drone arsenal with a effective, heavy missile capability, and that poses real issues for Russia.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, as we've had this conversation, it's just in the aftermath of those strikes on Kyiv, which have been some of the deadliest in recent months. And European leaders are obviously outraged about that. And there is a growing, I think, acceleration, especially amongst the Franco-German axis, to increase sort of the interoperability, if you like, of European and Ukrainian defense industry and sort of things like that. So what could you see this doing for the broader European continental zone, so to speak, their own industries and could the Ukrainians teach the Europeans a few things maybe? Because it certainly looks that way, doesn't it?
Definitely. I mean, if the war ends one way or another, I'm sure that these Ukrainian missile and long-range drone systems are going to flood the European market. Right. I think right now the entire capacity, production capacity is essentially eaten up by Ukraine. But these types of weapon systems. That's exactly what Europe needs also, right? Affordable long-range strike capabilities, especially those smaller European states, right? I mean, of course, France, UK, Germany, they have the budgets and the industry to perhaps also sustain, larger, more sophisticated missile arsenals. But if you look at a state like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland to some extent, obviously, right? These are states that are working with much more restricted defense budgets, but they, of course, still have a need for a conventional long-range strike capability. But so far, what Estonia, for example, has done, as well as its Baltic neighbors, they have bought, some ATACMS missiles. But Estonia, for example, they've bought a whole 18 of them, right? Because that is what they could afford in the moment. But Estonia itself knows that this is not enough, right? 18 missiles are not going to get you very far in a war against Russia. So, but now you turn it around, right? Now you say, okay, Ukrainian manufacturing capacity is open up and European states can place orders. Then I would say, this would be a prime candidate for, or like these types of missile systems, these lighter, smaller mini cruise missiles, long range drones. That's a prime candidate for a lot of European states in terms of their acquisition programs. And of course, European industry is also not sleeping, right? We have a bunch of missile startups in Europe, as well as in the United States, and also some companies that are also a bit more established that are moving in the same direction, right? That are moving towards building missile systems that have, punch, but at the same time are affordable. So I think this is, again, right, some type of natural progression that we're seeing here, moving from, very expensive long-range strike that was really only available to an elite number of states with large defense budgets towards affordable long-range strike capability, essentially a democratization of conventional missile technology spreading to many countries. And I think by and large, this can be very useful for the European continent in the future as how it responds to the Russian threat. And maybe also here the last point, right? I think because that's really interesting and something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of weeks. And this really demonstrate how Russia's cheating in the INF treaty, right, could really come back to bite them in the ass. Because obviously Europe was not part of the INF treaty, but Europe upheld the INF treaty by unilaterally saying, okay, we're not going to deploy those INF restricted systems. So 500 plus kilometer missile systems that are ground launched. And then, as we all know, Russia, they breached this treaty. They did not uphold it. They did not uphold it. I think right now this has advantages for Russia because they, put themselves in an asymmetric position where they move towards the acquisition of these ground launched 500 plus kilometer missile systems before Europe did. But if we now get to this scenario that I've just outlined, where suddenly you have a whole bunch of European systems that are terribly interested in acquiring these missile systems because of the Russian threat, and they're widely available and affordable, then suddenly things look a bit different, right? Then I think this could really come back to haunt Russia. And that's something I'm certainly hoping for.
Well, and that's quite a cliffhanger to end on, Fabian. As always, it's a big pleasure to have you. And, well, we look forward to having you back, maybe to discuss some of these significant developments, these advancements for Ukraine. And everyone, do check out Fabian's great work. His bio and links to some of his work will be in the description as well. And we'll see you all next time.